Let me go ahead and start off by saying that I really loved this game. I liked Fire Emblem 7 quite a bit, actually, but this one just kind of knocked it out of the park. Now, well, I don't want to get too much into the story stuff, but I only have a couple of notes about the gameplay. Most of the things about the gameplay are things I already mentioned back during Fire Emblem 7. You know, the fact that it's your turn-based grid, RPG, levels, gear, etc. It did have a lot of options, and I'm a huge fan advocate. I'm a huge advocate of games that have lots and lots of options in them. One of the things I praise most thoroughly about Bravely Default is the fact that you can play that game and it's got a bajillion different options for the gameplay. Even if the main plot is kind of lackluster, it is still very much a treat to play, and you can play it basically however you want to within the confines of a JRPG, of course. This is the same way. We've got the zoom feature, we've got the info tabs, and which have multiple tabs of info. We've got the animations, which can be turned on or off, or just for your side, or you can turn on animations just for a particular unit individually that you really like. You've got the changing classes, which enable you to keep leveling and switch them back and change up their abilities, which gives you a sort of a pseudo class system where you can start mixing and matching abilities from different classes, and they can upgrade, and just there's lots of other stuff. I'm not going to go down the whole list, but it's a lot of good stuff. And it made playing through this game an absolute treat. Probably the only mission in the entire game I didn't actively enjoy was the very last one, and I think that's mostly because the very last mission was basically just a gear check. There was no real strategy involved in the last mission. There was no terrain you could use to your advantage, no choke points, no attempt at, sitting on a fort or a forest or anything like that, and there was no way to prevent the enemies. The enemies just spawn forever. And so it's just go. It's basically a gauntlet at that point, and I didn't enjoy that much. I also want to praise the difficulty options in this one. You have the option to make it so that if you lose a unit, other than the two main ones, of course, you don't permanently lose them. You just lose them for the duration of the battle, which I thought was a nice in-between from Phoenix mode, which I have read about from Fates, which is a little ridiculous, and, permadeath. And, of course, there's a topic to be had there, but I've decided after some thought not to really discuss it, because I think it really comes down to individual preference. But I made the comment during my stream of a lot of players who play with permadeath on run into the XCOM problem. If you've never played XCOM, it runs like this. Let's say you're 20 missions in, 15 missions in, you're fairly far in, right? The enemies you're fighting at that point are pretty significant. Well, you just permanently lost one of your old veterans thanks to some bad RNG, or you made a mistake, or whatever, right? So now your team is weaker, and because of the nature of a game like this, and I kind of want to talk about this as well, you can't really fill that hole easily. You can't really carry a newbie. So at that point, while it is possible to continue forward, you're best suited to just go ahead and reload the save and get that character back, because there's simply too much investment in him, and you'll be so far behind the power curve, you'll probably always be behind the power curve, because you were just barely keeping up with it to begin with. You understand the analogy here? So, while it is possible to recover from a loss, it is a hassle. And in this game especially, so this doesn't have quite the XCOM effect, at least on the difficulties I was playing at. I didn't actually play on Lunatic, so I don't know if this is true on Lunatic. But, for example, it is possible to recover from that, to go get someone you haven't been leveling and go back and use those stupid reek boxes on earlier levels where you're fighting earlier stuff, and just kind of couch the newbie around. But, I don't know, my point here is that I don't fully understand the basic difference between having them come back at the end of the match or reloading the whole match. See, here's what I mean by this. Obviously, there are some differences there. In the case of losing someone for the match, you are now down a person for the remainder of that particular map, so your power for that map has been reduced. But you get them back at the end, so you don't have to go and grind your face up on a new character or reload. On the reload case, if you are allowing permadeath, you have a situation where, let's say, the reload cost, the cost of failure, is the fact that you've lost all progress into that mission thus far, so you have to start the map all over again. So I could kind of see how those two kind of balance each other out. I just don't, what I guess I don't get is I'll be honest, the vitriol that is flung with regards to those. None of my viewers actually were. My viewers were actually pretty cool about this, but I have read in forums and I have seen a lot of people who have been, shall we say, rather adamant about the fact that if you have permadeath off, then you're a cuss word, cuss word, cuss word, cuss word, who is cuss word, cuss word, cuss word, cuss word. And I don't think I quite get that mentality. It's a weird form of elitism, since most of the people who are saying that also freely admit that they reload saves if they lose someone who permadies, which, as I mentioned, is just a different form of consequence. So, I don't know. Whatever. I do want to talk about one other thing, though. I don't remember if I really talked about this on my ruminations. I talked about it on my stream several times. The idea is, these kind of games have always been strange for me, because I spend more time and effort leveling and guiding my characters towards whatever I want. In, like, Final Fantasy Tactics, it would be job points and job paths. In excuse me, in this game it would be supports, raising up their support so I could get the side conversations. And I spend more of my time, like, to explain what I mean by this, when I go into a battle, and I know I'm not the only one who does this, when I go into a battle, I'm not thinking, how do I win this? When I'm mathing out and planning out my tactics, I'm not thinking about victory. That's not even on the board. I'm not even thinking about that. I'm thinking about, how do I get the maximum amount of levels and of support for my units in the right way, in the right time, so that this person supports with this person, and this one supports with this person, and so forth and so on, right? Because I wanted to get the lore, I wanted to get the conversations, and of course I wanted to gain experience and to shore up who needed experience where. I mentioned that because from my perspective, some of my viewers will probably challenge this, and that's fine, you're still wrong, but from my perspective it's a completely different mindset. If I'm tactically thinking about winning, my mind goes into a completely different mode over here. What I was doing was trying to level it. And I mentioned that because I've done that in virtually every tactical RPG I've ever played. Because there's always something you need to raise or increase or whatever, right? I think that's probably one of the biggest reasons why I've never really been that much into tactical RPGs. Because, honestly, I find that to be a hassle. As much as I... And maybe this is just my fault, excuse me. Maybe this is just my fault for caring more about leveling the people or getting the right jobs I want or setting up, the support system or whatever. Maybe that's my fault for thinking more about how to properly be prepared for the next map than thinking about winning this one. Because in my mind, the only alternative to that would be to pick a superhero or two. Ramza can practically solo Final Fantasy Tactics, for example, if you set him up right, and just focusing on that character, which will lead to a ridiculously lopsided team for your side, but is still functional. If I just want to play the game, I could just make Ramza a superhero and push through FF Tactics. And I could probably just turn the Avatar and Crom into superheroes, which I actually did at this playthrough, and push through the maps and just do it that way. And that is functional, but also, if I'm being 100% honest, that's not fun for me. So my options are something that I don't enjoy. At that point, I'd rather just hit the I win button in order to see the cutscenes. Or something that I find it to be a hassle. I'm not saying this is a flaw of tactical RPGs overall. I'm just saying almost everyone I've played has this flaw, and I think it's a solvable flaw. Like, if I was to design a tactical RPG, I've actually come up with a couple methods, and some of my viewers have come up with other methods as well during the stream, where we could balance this out, make it so that you could focus on winning, and as a consequence of winning, gain the experience or support points or job points or secondary bonuses or whatever, so that you can then distribute those or shore up weaker characters or whatever, some way to make it so that you can not have to spend more of your time bringing your weak characters in order to make sure that you balance things out. I mean, to give you just one example of what I'm talking about, in XCOM, my strategy was usually, there's one carry, which is actually my mech guy, Samurai, and then everyone else is whoever my lowest levels are. Always pick the lowest levels so they can get some experience and catch up. And basically, in every mission, I was always bringing my weakest characters to try and slowly bring up the average power level of my team up. Make sense? So a way to bypass that kind of a thing. I don't know, I just wanted to talk about that briefly. If anybody has any thoughts or thinks that I'm just a terrible, stupid idiot, please feel free to share. Speaking of the easy mode thing, though, obviously Fates has an easier option than this, because it has Phoenix mode, which is basically you can't lose. But I was very curious of the difficulty on this, so I did a test. I did it live on camera. I did a thing where I basically threw tactics and strategy out the window. I wasn't trying to raise experience. I wasn't trying to raise weapon proficiency. I wasn't trying to get support. And I wasn't trying to win. I was basically randomly flinging people left and right to see what happened. I called it pants on head stupid strategy. And it was working. I actually succeeded at that mission. Now, that may sound like a bad thing, but I did this specifically with difficulty cranked as far down as it went, with permadeath off. In other words, that is as easy mode gets. And I did that as a test to see how easy mode is. I have been a strong advocate of the idea of casual difficulty for a long time. Now, I know that word has some charged connotations to it, but what I mean by that is I pull that deliberately from StarCraft 2. To reiterate, for those of you who haven't heard me talk about this, I am a strong advocate of the concept of there being a casual difficulty. Even in a game like Dark Souls, I know I've gotten some negative reactions to that, and I understand that completely. But I still stand by my point, because my point remains firm even in the face of opposition. And that point is, someone who doesn't like this type of gameplay should still be allowed, if they enjoy the story, to enjoy the story. I will use a direct example. My friend Gary, my best friend Gary, does not like RTSs. It's not that he's not good at them. He's actually passable at them. He could probably play through Warcraft 3 if he really wanted to. But he doesn't, because he doesn't enjoy RTSs. But he really likes the story. So, he turns on cheats and blazes through the maps so he can see the story. Now, a properly designed game either has cheats or a casual difficulty to service that exact function. You with me so far? In other words, someone who doesn't like tactical RPGs but wants to enjoy the story of Fire Emblem Awakening can. Because if you crank it down, it is fairly easy. Honestly, the only mission I had any difficulty at all with was the last one. I had three game overs in the entire run. One was pretty early on. That was a mistake on my part, and I'll just admit to that. The second, I never actually saw what happened. I literally wasn't looking at the screen while the enemy turn was happening. And then something happened, and then the avatar was killed. And I was like, huh? I just heard the music change, and I was like, wait, what? Game over. So I'm not sure what happened. That was on the volcano map. But I didn't actually have any trouble with the volcano map. It's just something happened, and I died. And then the final map, which I mentioned earlier. And honestly, the only reason I game over on that one was I didn't realize that the actual last boss had a range of 1 billion. It's actually like a range of 3, but still. Anyways, point being, I think that's a great thing. I think that's an excellent feature, and it's kind of part of that options thing I mentioned earlier that this game does so well. I want to mention one last thing gameplay-wise, then I'm going to get to the story. I've been arguing in my head with myself for years as to why I don't like Final Fantasy Tactics' gameplay. Now, I could give you a list. It's all a lot of little things. But overall, I just don't enjoy that style of gameplay. I had the same problem with Tactics Ogre, which I think is actually the Rumination you'll be getting next, but due to some strange things, I ended up playing Fire Emblem after Tactics Ogre. But point being, I had the same problem with that game. And I was trying to figure out why it is. And I've come up with an analogy that finally, I think, truly explains it. Fire Emblem and Advance Wars, for that matter, which I also enjoyed, and XCOM, are board games. Whereas Tactics Ogre and Final Fantasy Tactics are Battletech. Miniatures, in other words. And any of you who've played both of those, like I have, knows that those are basically completely different categories. Like, you could play a tactical board game, strategy board game. There's plenty. There's some good ones. And it's defined, very concrete. You know what's what. Everything's immediately presentable. Part of the UI is the fact that you can just at a glance tell exactly what you're looking at and exactly how you're looking at it, and figure out in your head what kind of things you need to do. When you're looking at especially a well-done map in BattleTech or Warhammer 40k or whatever, in a miniatures game, you look at that and it's like, well, okay. And generally what you have to do, speaking from personal experience, and this isn't just me, other players I used to play with do the same thing, you pull out the rulers, right? It's like, okay, hang on, this goes here, and get this here, 45 degrees, okay, and then this. So basically you would have to, test each move. It's like, okay, I was here, and you put a little marker there saying I was here, and then you could pick up your unit, and you haven't dedicated your turn yet because you're just seeing what you're capable of doing. And while the miniatures game, is far more complex, it also is less enjoyable for me personally because of the fact that it lacks that at-a-glance feature. I can't look at the map and say, well, I can do this or this or this. I can't, in my own words, and this is probably just because I'm stupid, I'll admit to that, but I can't strategize. I can only trial and error it, you know? Whereas in Fire Emblem or XCOM or a board game, I can strategize. I can sit back and think, well, I could do this, and then this, and this, and this, and this, and this. And if I do this, then I can do this, and this, and this, and this, and this. Okay, so if I do this, this, and this, and this, and this. All right, you know? So I think it's that difference that really helps me to enjoy games like Fire Emblem and Advance Wars and XCOM more than I can enjoy games like Tactics Ogre and Final Fantasy Tactics. I finally have an answer, guys. And I posit it to you for anybody who is having the same kind of issues with one game or the other. Let's talk about the story. If you rewatch the opening cinematic, it's actually funny to me how much of it spoils. Obviously, there will be spoilers in this video, duh. But I mean, in addition to the fact that Grima is on the intro twice, you also see Crom and Sumia getting married, and Lucina, and just a whole bunch of other stuff is spoiled right off the bat, especially if you're paying attention. And I know what you're thinking. Well, you don't have context for that, and that's true. But if you're playing this game, I mean, pay attention to this, because the intro shows Grima twice, and yet in-game, you don't see Grima until, like, Chapter 22, I want to say. It's right at the frickin' end of the game. And so, this whole time, you're like, where's the dragon? I mean, there's going to be some big evil dragon somewhere. But that kind of brings me to an interesting point. And I don't want to be too negative, because I did very much enjoy the story of this game, but I didn't like the plot. For those of you who haven't heard me say this a few thousand times, there are 5 points of story as I define them. Plot, characterization, character development, setting, themes, okay? So, decent characterization and, good characterization, decent character development in a couple of cases, and we had, it was an okay setting, not very bad, not very good, really good on themes. So all these 4 points are pretty nice and overall lead to an enjoyable experience. But for me, the main plot was just really, really weak. And when I got to thinking about that, I started realizing that that's not really unique to it, is it? To use the examples of several other games that I just mentioned, how strong is the main plot of XCOM? I mean, it's there, and it's part of the story, and I do enjoy the story of XCOM, but how strong is the plot of XCOM? Aliens invade. That's basically the plot. I mean, there's a couple other niggles here and there. How strong is the plot of Advance Wars? How strong is the plot of Fire Emblem 7? You know? Plot, in my experience, and I talked with a few other viewers and I read up on this a bit, does not seem to be a strong focus of this. It's far more, especially in the Fire Emblem series specifically, about the characters. And the characters were spot on. The writers who did the dialogue for the localization did it perfectly. And I do mean perfectly. A lot of the dialogue, I have absolute praise for the dialogue in this game, because even though it's very anime, as has been described before, with a lot of the classic tropes from animes, in no way do I consider that a negative thing. It was actually very well presented and very natural. It felt like the kind of conversations I could see real people having, rather than that age-old problem that writers have had for forever of writing dialogue that feels like people are reading from a script, you know? Now, I'm of a weird mindset when it comes to the, voice acting that was happening. Because, on the one hand, I legitimately understand why it is. There's an insane amount of dialogue in this game, and a lot of that dialogue is variable, based on who supports with whom, and when this person interacts with this person, all that fun stuff. There's a lot of dialogue, and a lot of optional dialogue, and a lot of variance on dialogue. So I understand the desire to not voice act all of it. That does make sense to me. But I have to say that, and I do understand the compromise of having some voice acting and the occasional important line voice acted. But I do have to say that after a while I just started toning it out, because it did get a little irritating going, oh, I see, back and forth. And I just started toning it out completely. I've decided after some thought I'm not going to dissect the time travel of this game. Oh yeah, by the way, there's time travel. It's not... Well, okay. It is debatably time travel. There is debatably time travel in this game. And I know that sounds weird, but there is a theory out there which has a decent amount of evidence that there's no time travel in this game. Now I know what you're thinking. Well, hang on. I mean, the avatar comes from the future, right? Or rather, the enemy avatar, the one that turns into Grima. No, that avatar comes from another dimension, which might simply be off sync with ours time-wise. In other words, if it's hour 10 for them, it's hour 1 for us, so we're offset. It's not actually that out of bounds, and given the fact that this game and Fates pretty much embrace the idea that all of the Fire Emblems exist within this vast multiverse with many, many dimensions and all that, shrug. Now, you guys know me, or maybe you don't, but I don't like multi-dimensional stories. I just don't. I could dissect that reasoning, but it doesn't matter. It's something I don't enjoy. So that kind of pushed me away, and I don't enjoy time travel when it's done badly, in my opinion. And I think the usage of time travel here was done kind of badly. I get the point of it, but ultimately I look at it and I think, ugh. It's very rare I can describe time travel in a game as literally being timey-wimey, but that is kind of the situation we had here. But I've decided after some thought not to really dissect it and go into it. I just wanted to mention that when I first found out about this plot, which was over a year ago, actually, long before I thought I was actually going to be able to play the game, my first reaction was, ugh, and just pushed it away. And my interest level plummeted because multi-dimension, time travel, blah, blah, blah. Okay, whatever. I'm glad I did stick with it because I did enjoy a lot of the other stuff. The character dynamic, like I said, was really good. And I became very invested in a lot of my characters. It's actually funny. Usually I'm really bad with names, and yet it got to the point where I could very clearly say names of characters rather than, for example, their classes, because of the fact that I was so invested in the characters and their little stories and the support conversations which carried out their backstory or fleshed out their individuals, all that stuff. The support system in general is a great feature, I just want to say. Even though I did feel it a bit of a hassle to focus more on that than anything else, I was very invested in it. Not because I wanted to make babies. Anybody who saw my stream can attest. I actually only had one actual coupling my entire game. That was Crom and Sumia. Everyone else hit A at best and then chopped them off and started something else. Muahaha. But my reason for bringing that up, though, is the support system is great story and gameplay integration. You literally get benefits from having support with someone. You'll get greater benefits from having a higher support from someone, the chance of blocking an attack completely or the chance of a multi-strike, that kind of a thing. Not a multi-strike, but when they hit as well as you. And it's a great story thing because you're learning more about these characters and these characters are getting more connected to each other. And of course this ties in the ending, which I'll go ahead and talk about now. There's this thing about, oh my god, all these people. Actually, I think I won't talk about that now. I'll get to that later. Keep it in the back of your mind. So I like that. That's good stuff. It really made it so that I was actually caring about these characters, and I could remember their names, and I could remember their faces, and I could remember bits of their details and backstory. This game, even though it's basically centered around Crom as a main character, does feel like an ensemble cast in many ways. And I like that, even though, the ensemble, as far as plot goes, is actually very small. We've got, like, Lissa and Crom and the Avatar, and then Flavia and Basilio all take a lot of front stage there, and then everyone else is just kind of occasionally there, like Frederick, for example. But as far as the overall presentation of the game, because of the support system, it felt like every character had at least some screen time, which is good. I don't have a lot of notes as far as the plot goes up until Emeren's death. Now let me go ahead and say that I liked that scene a lot. It didn't quite make me tear up. I'm not going to be like, oh, but it did get close. It was definitely an emotional blow. I was sufficiently invested in the characters, like I just mentioned, that when she died, it hit me pretty hard. But I also have to admit it was very well done for two big reasons. Number one, that was Emeren attempting to be the Mario in a setting that usually doesn't allow that. See, the Mario, as I've said many, many times, can only be the Mario if the setting he or she exists in allows them to be. For example, you can't drop someone in Warhammer 40k and be the Mario. It's actually impossible. By definition, being the Mario means being capable of being the Mario, doing action, verb, not just whatever your internal thoughts or feelings are. You may be a truly good person inside, but if you can't do anything about that, that's meaningless, right? So that's part of being the Mario. I am blown away by the way she approached this, because what she did was she decided, in a war-torn hellscape and a fairly crappy setting in many ways, to make a very strong gesture of her own passing, specifically as a protest. And she did it without hurting anybody. Well, other than Crom, of course. She did it without killing anyone. She did it without compromising her morals or her principles. She was the Mario. And it worked. Again, you can't be the Mario just internally. It has to be externally as well. The very next scene, the very next map, where the soldiers are talking about how much they don't want to fight you anymore, how they just want to desert the field. When you take out Gangrel, the people who have deserted en masse from Plegia, and are like, no, her action had significant impact on a continental scale. And that's awesome, the way they presented that. It's also a nice counterpart, because, and Crom himself points this out, we've got Crom, well, we've got Emmerin, who is basically a pacifist, but not really. See, when I usually say pacifist, I mean someone who doesn't do anything. Emmerin is what a pacifist should be. Someone who's willing to take action without willing to compromise her morals or principles in the matter. Again, the Mario kind of a thing, right? So she still did, but she never actually did wrong in the action of doing so. On the other side of things, we have Walhart. I got into the habit of calling him Walmart. I'm sure some of you can sympathize with that. It's also funnier if you think of him as Walmart. Anyways, Walhart, Richard Epcar, if you prefer, he did like the exact opposite. Full aggression, full violence, total survival of the fittest. Bend knee or die. Bend knee or die. Even those who actually bent knee still had to fight and kill and die in order to serve prove their loyalty. And yet, the funny thing is, both of these people, in their own ways, were actually working towards the same overall goal, with generally good intentions in mind. Crom, of course, is in the middle. He is a warrior who is willing to fight and does so on a regular basis, but he doesn't want to reach to the extreme of Walhart, but he doesn't want to reach to the extreme of Emmerin. And I like that kind of counterbalance of the three characters there, presenting them. And of course, this game is actually rather tragic. After Emmerin's death, there are a lot of soldiers on Plegia's side who die for what amounts to no reason other than the fact that they have a mad king, that Gangrel will hurt or murder them or their people, their families and whatnot, if they don't. It's one of those horrible situations where, for example, just to use the old slave arena concept, you don't want to hurt that person, but you have to hurt that person because otherwise that person will hurt you. And they have to hurt you because otherwise you will hurt them. And both of you don't have a choice because there's a guy with a whip at your back, It's messed up. One person posited a theory during the stream. I wanted to mention it here. Perhaps some of the weakness of the plot comes from accommodating the possibility of player death. Permanent death, I should say. I've thought about that a bit, and I wouldn't be... I'm not sure I disagree, but I'm not sure I agree either. There's certainly evidence to show that a game in which there can be characters that permanently die, those characters should not have a strong presence in the plot. I mean, I can see the logic there. And that probably explains one of the reasons why, despite this ensemble cast, very few characters actually have cutscenes during the actual main plot things. But, that being said, having thought about it, I'm not sure that's a valid excuse. It just might explain some of the reasoning of the writers. And I can give you a direct example, and I know, I haven't talked about it yet for you guys' perspective, but Tactics Ogre has permadeath for characters, and has an extremely strong, very main plot, and that plot is probably the core branch of, the core trunk of what makes Tactics Ogre so amazing. So, not sure that's valid. That brings me to something else, while we're talking about the plot thing. I have to admit, I'm a little discouraged by the plot. I know, I keep saying that, but hear me out. Of Fire Emblem Awakening, because it's a fantasy plot. Just a fantasy plot. For those of you who have heard me talk about Fire Emblem 7, and I just praised this, and I'll be talking about this with Tactics Ogre, I like it when the political plot and the fantasy plot are perfectly married together. I'm pretty sure I talk about this exactly in Tactics Ogre. But to reiterate, or from your perspective here for the first time, I really wish these had been done in order. In Final Fantasy Tactics, the fantasy plot, the Lucavi plot, and the political plot of the War of the Lions, these were perfectly married together. You could not have the Lucavi plot without the political plot, and you could not have the political plot without the Lucavi plot. They were perfectly in sync. It's one of the reasons I call it one of the most well-written plots I've ever seen in anything, ever. Okay? Tactics Ogre was like 99% political and, well, a little bit of fantasy right at the end. Fire Emblem 7, the only previous Fire Emblem I've played, was like maybe 20-30% political and then like 70% fantasy. I've said it before and I've said it again. I like the idea of the marriage between the two. I like the idea of a political plot that has an external force that affects it. FF12 did this as well. This game doesn't have that. There are some politics on display, and there are some, some functionalities of war and logistics and all that, but there's no actual political plot here in any real sense of the word. This game is entirely the fantasy plot. And on the one hand, I felt that to be a little bit disappointing, to be completely honest. But on the other hand, I'm kind of glad they at least embraced it. If they had done like 99% fantasy plot, 1% political plot, that would actually be bad in my opinion. So I'm glad they just embraced the fantasy plot and went with it. Now the plot does have an interesting structure. It's a 3-act structure. And each act does something weird. And I'm going to talk about this in just a moment here, as soon as I get to my next page of my notes. Yeah, here it is. It's my next note on the second page here. I was right. Each act is structured the same. You start off doing well, and then things go bad, and then we're the underdog, and then the underdog triumphs against impossible odds to succeed. All three chapters, all 3 acts of this game have that exact same structure. And it felt kind of weird that in each case we were somehow once again behind and then had to struggle against odds. I mean, I get why they did that. They wanted to make it so that the player was constantly playing the underdog. Everyone likes to root for the underdog, right? And they wanted to make it so that you were constantly striving and pushing against unsurmountable odds. And I get that too. But it did feel weird that, it just kept happening like that. And each time, of course, the threat was escalated. Plagia was a threat, but not as huge of a one as Valm, which is not as huge of a one as Grima, right? It makes sense. Shrug. I don't know. I do want to say one thing that they did very well. I don't actually have that many more notes on the story. That's actually funny. They have some subtlety. I mentioned complexity in storytelling. There is definitely complexity in the storytelling here. There's a lot of little details that they don't spell out for you, and they allow you, the player, to figure out for yourself. Valadar's plan as the Plagian King is a great example of this. He wants you to fight against Valm. After all, Valm is the enemy of the Grimleal, just as everything else is, basically. And he wants you to succeed against him, so he is willing to support you in your fight against Valm. But not with men. And it's a brilliantly subtle bit, because if he gave you men, he wouldn't be able to have those men in order to be able to use against you when you or Valm succeeded. Remember, he doesn't care about the politics here. He doesn't care about the nation versus the nation. He doesn't care about the conqueror or the hero. He cares about resurrecting Grima. That's all he cares about. So, the idea of supplying them, I wanted to say providing and supplying at the same time, supplying them with tons and tons of ships and material and money, but no people, makes a lot of sense. After all, what the hell does ships and material and money mean to him? People, on the other hand, well, that's an interesting and useful currency, especially since they're literally the food needed for Grima to get up. Just food for thought there. That's actually it for my notes until the end game, so I'm going to spitball a couple of things here really quick. I do like how the game goes out of its way to emphasize that the main character, the Avatar, is a tactical, outside-the-box thinker. I'm not going to call them a genius necessarily, but they consistently have outside-the-box thinking, and it's showed on screen through the whole game, really. From like the very first mission, where they talk about this. My avatar was female, so if I say she, that's why. Where the Avatar was, presenting options and tactical abilities, and then the victory against Plagia, and then the victory in the naval battle, and then the victory at the volcano, and so forth and so on. Over and over and over, the tactician, the Avatar, constantly showed great tactical thinking and foresight. Now, that's very important because it leads me to what is, in my opinion, the weakest scene in the entire game. There's a scene where right at the beginning, we see a flash forward, which is actually a premonition from the other timeline that future/alternate timeline Avatar has, actually happening. I know, just bear with me. This premonition plays out, they defeat Valadar, and then she stabs Crom. The end, right? Well, thing is, that cutscene plays exactly the same as when you defeat Valadar in our timeline. And I do mean exactly the same. Now, here's the thing. Leading up to the confrontation with Valadar, there's sections of the story where Lucina approaches you and is like, "Rawr, I will kill you for the sake of my father," which ironically would have doomed the world, but let's not get into that. "I will kill you for the sake of my father," and you can accept that, and especially if you're her mother or father, well, you can't be her father. If you're her mother, it's a much more poignant scene. If you're male, you could be romantically related. Point being, there's a lot of strength in that scene. It's a good scene with great music playing. But the thing is, it's all portrayed straight. At no point does the Avatar say, "I have a plan." At no point does the Avatar say, "Don't worry, I'm thinking about it," or "I've got an idea," or "Trust me." Never is that said. Crom has to intervene and say, "No, you can't do this. We have to trust in them." And it's presented as if Crom is, and I'm going to be as blunt about this as possible, an idiot. As if Crom just says, "I know that my closest ally can be mind-controlled, but it's okay, because I trust them." Trust doesn't matter if they can be mind-controlled. The real person you can trust all you want. Mind control kind of surpasses that. That's the point of mind control. And then, of course, we get to the big scene, and it's like, aha, it was all a plan from the beginning. Now, see, here's the thing. From an in-lore perspective, that makes perfect sense. As I already mentioned, the Avatar, I keep going to call her the tactician. The Avatar has shown adept future planning and tactical thinking the entire game. It would be nonsensical. It would actually be bad writing if she suddenly picked up the idiot ball and didn't have a plan for this final confrontation, especially since she's already had that premonition, which Lucina confirmed. So, the idea that she wouldn't have a plan is ridiculous, right? But I call it irritating. I dislike that scene because it's narrative cheating. That's what I call it. But several other people have different terms for this. One of my viewers, Takota, I think, mentioned it's the old detective novel problem. In other words, there are some detective novels where there's a mystery, but the novel goes out of its way to not give you the information you, the reader, need. The third-person perspective, out of character, the information you need to solve the mystery. And then it's like, oh, it was this person, and here's the information that expands on that. It doesn't matter if it makes sense in character. It's narrative cheating. And that's what this game does. At no point does it actually show any of the stuff they talk about. It's just, oh, by the way, there was this plan all along. Okay, that's great. Could you have showcased that or highlighted that? And I hate narrative cheating. I hate it when things pull that off. Especially since, again, I mentioned, the cutscene that plays is the exact same cutscene. I think it's literally the same movie file that plays. So, ugh. That really bothered me because it should have been a great come-from-behind victory moment, which fills the theme of what's been going on in each chapters, right? We're at the verge of defeat. But it wouldn't have even taken much just to have the Avatar be like, I have an idea. We've got the ace. Don't forget the ace in the hole. They could have just mentioned the ace in the hole. Don't explain that it's Basilio or the real Fire Emblem. Just be like, we've got that ace in the hole. We've got to work on this. And then, like before the battle, have the Avatar say to themselves something like, I got to remember... got to pull back. I got to remember to pull back. I got to remember to pull back. And so the audience wouldn't know what that means, pulling back, but the information's there so that when she actually does pull back, and in other words, restrict her magical power so she doesn't kill Crom, we, the audience, now knows what she meant. And it's like, instead of, huh? It wouldn't have been hard to do, and it really killed what otherwise should have been a very great moment for me. Let's talk about the ending a little bit. So, up on Grima's back, you have the Unity theme, right? Now, the Unity theme is an extremely common one in fiction, and I mean extremely common. What's funny is I have been blasted for liking the Unity theme in FF6, but mentioning it in a negative connotation elsewise. That's because those people are stupid. No, seriously, though. There's a difference in complexity. And I'm not saying FF6 is perfect, because I've got other examples too. It depends on how you present the Unity theme. I admit I've gotten weary of the standard Unity theme. The standard Unity theme is, I am defeated, my friends are supporting me, I win. That's the standard Unity theme. Like, no complexity, no shadings. And that is what Fire Emblem Awakening does. It wasn't bad, But I admit I was just kind of tired through the scene, as it was like, okay, yes, her friends are supporting her and that not. I'll talk a little bit about this in a moment, okay? Just don't judge me just yet. Because I want to give some other examples. I mentioned FF6. I think FF6's Unity theme worked because it wasn't because the entire overall theme of FF6 was about the connections between people, whether it be, granddaughter to adopted grandfather, or father to dog, or friends to other friends, or brother to brother. There were all those different types of connections between people. Basically, it was a game all about social. Just the word social and what that actually means, and it was a nice game in that respect. So it worked in FF6's cases because they built up for that. In Earthbound, the Unity theme worked because the Unity wasn't actually with the player characters at all. It was us. I know, meta, but it's true. The player is what granted the Unity along with all the other people in order to finally make it so that they could accomplish their victory against Gygas. In Undertale, I don't want to spoil Undertale, but that one worked very well because, again, it was the core concurrent theme throughout the whole work that idealism and hope can win things out even when they shouldn't. That kind of optimism thing. And there's one other one, Paper Mario 2, but I don't want to go into every example. I've decided to just skip through it. The point being, in each of these cases, they did something other than the basic Unity theme. There was some other shading or flavor or variant that enabled it to work, in my mind. And even if it's not the highlight of the game, it is still something that was a positive. Now here's where I mentioned don't judge me just yet, because I started thinking about it after the Unity theme happened, and I realized, well, hold on, this is perfectly in keeping with the theme of Fire Emblem Awakening. What did I just praise a few minutes ago? The support system. A gameplay and story integrated method of indicating the themes and bonds of connection between people. Arguably, I would say that is the main theme of the entire game. I'd say the second, actually. The second main theme. There's another theme I haven't even talked about yet. I would say that's the second biggest theme of the whole game. That it is the connections between people that enable them to accomplish more than they otherwise would. And that is represented in gameplay in the fact that you literally get stat boosts if you're fighting alongside someone you have good rapport with. And there is real evidence for that kind of thing in real life. If you are fighting alongside someone you have trained with and worked with and you will probably do better than if you're fighting alongside someone you've never even met before. Or if you're fighting alone. Now, there's exceptions, of course, but you get the logic, don't you? And so when I started thinking about it, I was like, this actually fits perfectly with Awakening. My only possible complaint, and this applies to the ending as well, is that it would actually be nice if they had taken it a step further. Make it so that you actually get stat boosts, or like a lack of negative stat boosts, based on your support system. For example, let's say your avatar was at A support with like everyone, and you had actually bothered to do that. So when you get to the end game, you have all these A support conversations, which vary from B support, C support, or none. And then having all that A support, you are like super buffed. You can just run to the boss and one-shot him because you bothered to go that far. Or maybe you have, and so basically make each support level of each character like a +1, basically. Just one little stat. But you could see how that could kind of make that integrate and really reward the player for doing that, in addition for the support cutscenes you saw, showcasing that bond at the end and proving Grima wrong, that the bonds between people, which Valadar talked about too, are not insignificant and inferior, but are actually things that matter. Just food for thought. I think that would really help that scene a lot. Speaking of which, the ending. I've said this before and I've said this again. I don't like it when any fictional work kills off a character and then brings them back and does it badly. In other words, if you're going to kill off a character, don't do what several things have done, where it's like, oh my god, they're dead, 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 they're dead. Oh my god, oh my god, oh my god, they're dead, they're dead, they're dead. Emphasis, 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 emphasis. They're back! Don't spend a huge amount of time on their frickin' death if you're just going to bring them back. I know that sounds weird, but it's basically cheating, because the longer it goes on, the more you, the viewer, are going to be thinking, oh, they're coming back to life. And it loses its impact. I've talked extensively about the whole bringing a character back from death thing and why it's significant in fiction. I'm not going to go into my full thoughts there. But to continue my thoughts from earlier, wouldn't it be cool if you only came back after dying if you hit a certain support rating? Like, again, imagine each support level is like a +1, and you have to get like 50 or something. That's a made-up number, maybe like 25. So you have to get 25 total improvements in support relationships across the game with anybody in order to have that support be enough to bring you back. Because remember, Naga flat out says the thing that might give you a chance to come back from the dead is your connections with people. So again, that would be a nice way to have gameplay and story integration, and, this is very important, give the player agency, because now the player can decide, can choose, can work towards a better ending. I've been blasted a lot for my opinions on having good endings. In fact, some people thought my ending in Mass Effect 3 that I proposed a few times was just too sappy and just too good. But my counter-argument was always, it was only that good if you worked for it. You had to do everything right across 3 games in order to accomplish that. I like that. I like rewarding the player for earning it, and I like the player getting to choose it. Because ultimately, we get to decide how we play through these games, and the more agency we have in how we play through them, the better, in my opinion. And of course, that also leads to natural replay value. You know? Last couple of thoughts here. So I mentioned, let's talk about Grima really quick. So this, speaking of Mass Effect 3, occasionally I've been quoted from something I said back then. That was almost I was over 5 years ago now. And then I have said something recently, and they say, well, these two things contradict each other. To which I've said, yeah, my opinions change over time. But to make this more clear, I disagree with myself in the past on several issues. One of the things I said back in the day was that the Reapers shouldn't be explained. I kind of disagree with that now. But to explain what I mean more properly, if the Reapers were never explained in the game, I could accept that as long as there was an explanation under the hood. In my opinion, if the writers introduce an element to a game, book, movie, whatever, a work of fiction, the underpinnings of why and how should be thought out. Having a strong, shall we say, base, bedrock for your story, this under the hood stuff, will enable you to make a more coherent and generally more complex and more fleshed out surface level, which is the stuff that's actually on the pages or in the game, as the case may be. So this stuff is more better, because of the fact that you did a good bedrock, and this has been proven in many, many cases. But second of all, it shows good writing. It shows that you care enough to bother to think about how your setting works, not just how it works in service of the plot. I've said many times one of the most common aspects of lazy writing is because plot. Why did this happen? Well, because the plot demanded it. I've blasted Voyager for that several times, and I've talked about that in other works as well. And I feel like in many ways Grima was because plot. And if you ask me 100% honestly, I'd say he was probably because plot. Now, I have heard some theories about him over the years, and I've heard over the months, because I've actually been researching this one for a bit now. And one of the most common theories I've heard is that Grima is actually Lopter. Now, if you don't know who that is, don't even worry about it. And I've also heard the theory that he is both Lopter and Medeus. And if you don't know who that is, don't worry about it. It seems kind of like a cheat of an answer, and I'm not sure I agree with it. I thought about a variant of this being this dimension's Grima as opposed to another dimension's Lopter. Different names, but same character across dimensions. But ultimately, I don't like that explanation as well. And I really wanted to come up with some kind of explanation for Grima, because I'm just going to tell you right now, there is none. If there has ever been any ancillary work or interview or anything where the people involved in making this game have actually said, oh, this is what Grima is, to my knowledge, it has never happened. He's a big evil dragon, and he has certain rules about him that don't conform to the way other dragons work in the Fire Emblem series. It's mentioned he might have been an Earth dragon, but then that doesn't explain why he doesn't have any of the aspects of being an Earth dragon, and so forth and so on. So I posit to you my theory that I finally came up with. I finally came up with an explanation for Grima. You ready for this? I think Grima was an Earth dragon. I think he was one of the Earth dragons who saw the coming crisis, and the whole, power leads to dissension thing. I mentioned this in FE7, but the Earth dragons in specific, if they don't become Monoketes, or Monoketes, or however you're supposed to pronounce it, they just degenerate. They basically turn into raving, violent beasts. Now, Grima is clearly not a raving violent beast, but he is also just as clearly not given up his draconic form. So, my theory is that Grima sought an alternate path. He didn't want to give up his draconic powers. He didn't want to give up, his sanity. He had to find another route. I think he wanted to become death. As in, literally, the personification, avatar, and concept of death. Now, my original theory was that he succeeded at that, but upon retrospect and really thinking about it, I don't think that fits. I think he was still in the process of attempting to accomplish this. And I think this fits a lot of the aspects of his character. The fact that he consumes souls and the dead in order to be fed, in order to function. The fact that he, in many ways, is basically dedicated towards the end of everything, the death of everything. The fact that he is in such opposition to Naga, who herself has been very clearly demonstrated to be someone who is in favor of life, and a few other things. I think if you know the game, you can kind of see how the pieces fall in. And I think this was Grima's last-ditch effort to try and become sane without becoming a Manakete, or Manakete, whatever, a person thing. Now the thing is, there's a line about where Grima actually apologizes. It's in one of the DLCs, where Grima apologizes for all the pain and suffering Grima's caused them. And this brings me to think something. Would it be interesting if, in this desire to become death, that's what ended up corrupting him? Remember, in Fire Emblem 7, Nurgle was a decent guy, and a good guy, who sought power. And as I mentioned, one of the themes of that game was that the more actual personal power you had, the less of you had. You had to make room, basically, for that power, and your self, your sanity, your sense of morals or ethics or whatever just kind of slowly went away. And there is a bit of that theme in this game as well. Would it not be interesting if Grima had originally been a decent being, but the power necessary to become this new death avatar was so sufficient that all other concepts went away? Now, I know this basically turns Grima into a draconic version of Nurgle, but I still think it fits. And I still think that's just my personal theory on it. Final thoughts. I haven't mentioned the main theme of this game yet, but it's kind of obvious, which is why I'm saving it for last, because I don't feel like this is teasing or anything. The main theme is the fact that there's no destiny. Now, I think this is one of the best written things in this game. I'd say the second best written thing, after the dialogue between characters. The game goes out of its way through, I'd say, 5/6 or more, like a huge percentage of the game, seems to be indicating that destiny is a river. Or in other words, you can't change destiny. And many times it's overemphasized. I'm not even going to go into every single example. Constantly it's emphasized how you're always fated to do something. Destiny is always pulling you towards a certain path. You may have agency to decide your path, but you're always going to end up here. Wonderfully meta, too, because as I've talked about in previous months, the whole all roads lead to Rome style of game design is exactly that. You can decide how you get to point B, but you're always going to point B. And that's how Destiny is presented in this game. Right towards the end, they finally hammer the point in that that's actually completely not true. The only reason that Destiny was going on its path was because there was someone actively making that happen. Lucina and her actions had actually changed history several times, and the future Avatar had to step in and change them back, because otherwise their plans would have been completely ruined at several junctures. And several of these are called out specifically. And you can see how it lines up as you go through the game. But probably my favorite example by far is Basilio. The fact is, I noticed this even in the moment, actually, but it became even more clear during the bad scene I mentioned earlier. But even when Basilio was fighting Walhart, I realized, well, this is different. Lucina has changed history here, because last time Basilio went alone and died here. And then Walhart gets the gem, and then things go to hell, right? Well, in this case, Basilio went with Flavia, gave the gem to her, and she leaves. Lucina, even though it looks like destiny hasn't been changed, it has. Later we learn it's been changed even more, because Basilio realized he could play dead, and then serve as the perfect spy, as a part of our agency, as a part of under the Avatar's big tactical plan. And I actually like this a lot, the idea that there is no destiny at all, there is no fate whatsoever, and those who keep spouting it are doing it because they're either idiots, like Valadar, who thinks that there's some big cosmic plan and that's just what's going to happen, or Grima, who is so incredibly arrogant as to presume that whatever he chooses is going to happen, and that's just the end of it. And I really like that presentation of it, and I love it because, again, in an example of very good writing, it is woven through every aspect of the narrative throughout the entirety of the game, concluding with the end where you say, yeah, screw Destiny, kill yourself, and kill Grima permanently in the process. That's all. This was a great game. I really loved going through it. Next week for you will be Tactics Ogre. For me, I'm going to be moving on from Tactical RPG Month to RPG Month, because next up is Pillars of Eternity for me. So either way, I hope to see you guys next time.